What if I told you that most lies don't hide in what people say, but in how they say it, and once you learn to hear them, you won't be able to unhear them again? There is a silent struggle that begins the moment a person chooses to step away from truth. It is not always visible in their face, nor obvious in their gestures, but it inevitably finds its way into their words. Language, after all, is not just a tool for communication, it is a mirror of inner states. When someone speaks from truth, there is a certain fluidity, a natural rhythm that doesn't require effort. But when discomfort enters the mind, when there is something to hide or adjust, that rhythm begins to fracture in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The words may still come out, but they no longer flow. They stumble, they hesitate, they search for balance. This discomfort is not accidental. It is the psychological tension between what is real and what is being presented. The mind, in an attempt to maintain coherence, must work harder to construct a version of reality that does not exist, and that effort leaks into speech. You may notice slight pauses where there shouldn't be any, or sentences that start confidently but dissolve into vagueness. These are not simply quirks of communication. They are signs of internal conflict trying to resolve itself in real time. One of the most common manifestations of this hidden tension is hesitation. Not the natural pause of someone reflecting, but a fragmented interruption in speech that feels misplaced. It often appears before key details, as if the speaker is buying time, not to remember, but to fabricate or adjust. These micropauses may seem insignificant on the surface, yet they carry a weight that attentive ears can detect. They are the mind's way of negotiating between truth and invention, trying to ensure that what comes next does not contradict what has already been said. Another revealing pattern is the use of unnecessary detail. When someone is grounded in truth, they tend to provide information that is relevant and proportionate to the question. But when discomfort is present, there is often an urge to overcompensate. The speaker begins to add layers, extra descriptions, precise timings, unrelated context, as if complexity could serve as a substitute for authenticity. It creates an illusion of credibility, but in reality, it exposes the effort behind the narrative. The story becomes heavier, not clearer, and within that weight, the discomfort quietly reveals itself. There is also a certain rigidity that can appear in speech under these conditions. Words may sound rehearsed, almost mechanical, lacking the spontaneity that usually accompanies genuine expression. It is as if the person is not speaking freely, but rather following an internal script that must not be deviated from. This rigidity is another form of tension, a sign that the mind is focused not on communication, but on control. Every word is chosen carefully, not to express, but to avoid exposure. What makes this hidden language so fascinating is that it operates beneath conscious awareness. Most people are not deliberately inserting these signals into their speech. In fact, many believe they are being convincing, but the human mind is not designed to hold contradictions effortlessly. When there is a gap between what is felt and what is said, something must give. And often, it is the natural harmony of language. And then there is the tone, the subtle shifts in energy that accompany these verbal patterns. A sentence may begin with confidence and end with uncertainty. A voice may slightly tighten, almost imperceptibly, as it approaches a sensitive point. These changes are not random. They are reflections of the internal pressure building beneath the surface. Even when the words seem correct, the way they are delivered carries traces of discomfort that attentive listeners can sense without fully understanding why. In this way, language becomes more than a vehicle for meaning. It becomes evidence of emotional states. The discomfort of a lie does not remain hidden in the mind. It escapes through rhythm, structure, and tone. And those who learn to listen beyond the surface begin to notice that what is said is only part of the story, while the way it is said reveals everything else. There is a quiet elegance in truth that often goes unnoticed, When something is real, it does not struggle to exist. It simply presents itself with clarity and proportion. A simple question invites a simple answer, and there is a natural balance between what is asked and what is given. But when that balance is disturbed, when the answer becomes longer, heavier, and more detailed than the question requires, it is worth paying attention because something deeper may be unfolding beneath the surface. Over-explaining is not just a communication habit, it is often a psychological response. When a person moves away from truth, they step into uncertainty. And uncertainty creates a need for reinforcement. The mind begins to anticipate doubt, even if no one has expressed it yet. In an attempt to prevent suspicion, the speaker adds more information than necessary, believing that detail will create credibility. But what actually happens is something quite different. The explanation becomes inflated, and in that inflation, the effort becomes visible. Imagine asking someone a straightforward question, something that requires a brief and direct response. Instead of receiving that, you are given a long sequence of events, complete with precise timestamps, unrelated side notes, and elaborate justifications. At first, it may sound convincing, even impressive in its depth, but as it continues, a subtle shift occurs. The abundance of detail begins to feel less like clarity and more like construction, as if the speaker is building a structure to support something fragile. This tendency to over-explain often comes from a fear of being misunderstood or challenged. The person may believe that if they leave out even the smallest piece of information, their story could collapse under scrutiny. So they compensate by adding everything they can think of, hoping that quantity will protect them from questions. But in doing so, they create the very effect they are trying to avoid. The explanation draws attention to itself, not because of its truth, but because of its excess. There is also an emotional component to this behavior. When someone is telling the truth, they are usually connected to their experience in a direct and uncomplicated way. They do not need to convince themselves as they speak. But when the story is fabricated or altered, the speaker must maintain a certain level of internal alignment to keep it consistent. This requires effort, and that effort often manifests as elaboration. The more they talk, the more they try to stabilize the narrative, filling in gaps that might otherwise expose inconsistencies. Interestingly, over-explaining does not always come across as nervous or uncertain. In some cases, it can sound confident, even authoritative. The speaker may present their story with a sense of control, guiding the listener through each detail as if nothing is out of place. But beneath that surface, there is often a subtle urgency, a need to keep talking, to prevent interruptions, to avoid questions that could disrupt the flow. It is not just about sharing information, it is about managing perception. Another aspect to consider is relevance. In truthful communication, details tend to serve a purpose. They help clarify, illustrate, or support the main point. But in over-explained narratives, relevance becomes blurred. Information appears that does not directly contribute to the answer, creating a sense of distraction. These extra elements may seem harmless, but they often function as padding, designed to make the story feel more substantial than it actually is. What makes over-explaining particularly revealing is that it often feels unnecessary, even to the listener who cannot immediately identify why. There is a subtle intuition that something is disproportionate, that the response does not match the simplicity of the question. This feeling is not based on logic alone. It is a response to the imbalance between effort and content. In the end, over-explaining is less about communication and more about compensation. It reflects the speaker's attempt to bridge the gap between what is real and what is being presented, using words as a form of support for something that cannot stand on its own. There is a subtle but powerful shift that occurs when a person begins to distance themselves from what they are saying. It is not always obvious, and it rarely draws immediate attention, yet it changes the entire structure of communication. Language, when it is rooted in truth, tends to be direct and personal. It carries ownership. A person says, I did this or I felt that, and there is a natural alignment between the speaker and the statement. But when discomfort enters the equation, that alignment begins to loosen. The speaker almost instinctively starts to create distance, not from the listener, but from their own words. This distance can take many forms, and one of the most common is the shift in pronouns. Instead of saying I, the speaker may begin to say you, we, or even refer to themselves in a more abstract way. It is a small change, but it carries significant meaning. By removing themselves from the center of the statement, they reduce the sense of responsibility attached to it. The action no longer feels fully owned. It becomes shared, generalized, or even detached from any specific individual. This linguistic maneuver creates a kind of psychological buffer, allowing the speaker to speak without fully confronting what they are saying. Another way this distance appears is through vagueness. Specificity requires clarity, and clarity demands a certain level of commitment to truth. When someone is uncertain or attempting to conceal something, they may avoid precise language. Instead of giving clear answers, they offer approximations. Around that time, something like that, kind of. These phrases soften the edges of the statement, making it less concrete and therefore less vulnerable to scrutiny. The more vague the language becomes, the harder it is to challenge, but also the less grounded it feels. There is also a tendency to avoid direct answers altogether. When asked a question that requires a clear response, a person may respond indirectly, circling around the topic without ever fully addressing it. This is not always done consciously. In many cases, it is an automatic response to internal discomfort. The mind recognizes the risk in a direct answer and chooses a safer path, one that maintains ambiguity. The result is a conversation that feels slightly off, as if something important has been left unsaid, even though many words have been spoken. This distancing is not limited to grammar or structure. It also appears in tone and delivery. A person may speak in a way that feels detached, almost as if they are narrating rather than participating. Their words may lack the emotional connection that typically accompanies genuine experience. It is as if they are describing something from the outside rather than expressing something from within. This tonal distance reinforces the linguistic patterns, creating a consistent sense of separation between the speaker and the content of their message. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is that it often goes unnoticed in casual conversation. The listener may not consciously register the shift in pronouns or the increase in vagueness, but they may feel a subtle sense of disconnection. Something does not quite align. The words are there, the sentences are complete, yet the message feels incomplete. This is the effect of distance. It does not erase communication, but it weakens its authenticity. There is also an element of self-protection in this behavior. By creating distance, the speaker reduces their emotional exposure. If the statement is questioned or challenged, they are not fully attached to it. They have left themselves room to adjust, to reinterpret, or even to withdraw. This flexibility can be useful in certain situations, but it also reveals an underlying lack of confidence in what is being said. Truth, when it is fully owned, does not require such escape routes. In many ways, the power of distance in words lies in its subtlety. It does not rely on obvious contradictions or dramatic shifts. Instead, it operates quietly, reshaping language just enough to create separation without drawing attention. And yet, for those who learn to listen closely, these small changes become meaningful signals, indicators that the speaker is not fully standing behind their own words. There is a delicate harmony that exists between what a person says and what they feel. When someone speaks from a place of truth, their words and emotions tend to move together, almost like two parts of the same rhythm. The tone supports the message, the facial expressions align with the content, and there is a sense of coherence that does not need to be analyzed to be understood. It simply feels right. But when this harmony is disrupted, When words and emotions begin to tell different stories, something unusual emerges, something that may not be immediately obvious, yet is deeply perceptible. This phenomenon, often described as emotional mismatch, is one of the most revealing aspects of human communication. It occurs when the verbal message does not align with the emotional signals that accompany it. A person may say something reassuring, yet their tone carries tension. They may express confidence, yet their delivery feels uncertain. These contradictions are not always dramatic. In fact, they are often subtle, appearing in small shifts of voice, slight hesitations, or fleeting expressions that pass almost unnoticed, and yet they create a sense of inconsistency that the mind quietly registers. One of the reasons emotional mismatch is so significant is because emotions are difficult to fabricate convincingly. Words can be chosen, structured, and adjusted with relative ease, but emotions are more spontaneous. They arise from internal states that are not always under conscious control. When a person attempts to present something that does not align with what they truly feel, they must manage not only their language, but also their emotional expression. This dual effort often leads to small discrepancies, moments where the mask slips just enough to reveal what lies beneath. Consider a situation where someone says, "I'm not upset," but their voice is slightly tighter than usual, or their pacing is off. The words deny the emotion, but the delivery suggests otherwise. This creates a subtle tension in the interaction. The listener may not immediately challenge the statement, but they may feel a quiet sense of doubt. It is not based on evidence in the traditional sense, but on an intuitive recognition that something does not align. This mismatch can also appear in the timing of emotional responses. When emotions are genuine, they tend to emerge naturally in sync with the content of the message. But when they are constructed or suppressed, there may be a delay or an exaggeration. A reaction may come too quickly, as if it has been prepared in advance, or too slowly, as if the person is catching up with what they are supposed to feel. These temporal inconsistencies add another layer to the overall sense of disconnection. Another important aspect of emotional mismatch is its cumulative effect. A single inconsistency may not be enough to raise concern, but when multiple small mismatches occur within the same interaction, they begin to form a pattern. The voice does not quite match the words. The expressions shift at unexpected moments. The emotional tone fluctuates in ways that feel disproportionate to the situation. Over time, these signals create an impression that something is not fully aligned, even if the exact cause remains unclear. It is also worth noting that emotional mismatch is not always a sign of intentional deception. Human emotions are complex, and people can experience conflicting feelings at the same time. Nervousness, discomfort, or stress can also create discrepancies between words and tone. However, when this mismatch appears in contexts where clarity and sincerity are expected, it becomes more significant. It suggests that there may be an internal conflict influencing the way the message is being delivered. What makes emotional mismatch particularly powerful is that it operates on a level that is both conscious and unconscious. The listener may not be able to articulate what feels off, but the sensation is there. It is a quiet signal, a subtle indication that the surface of the conversation does not fully reflect what lies beneath. And in that space between words and emotions, a deeper truth often begins to emerge. There is something undeniably persuasive about certainty. When a person speaks with confidence, without hesitation, using firm and definitive language, it creates a sense of stability in the listener. It feels reassuring, almost comforting, as if there is no room for doubt or ambiguity. But this apparent strength can sometimes be misleading. In certain moments, what sounds like confidence is not a reflection of truth, but a strategy to protect something fragile. And it is precisely in this excess of certainty that a deeper insecurity can begin to reveal itself. When people are grounded in truth, they do not always need to sound absolute. Reality, by its nature, allows for nuance. It leaves space for uncertainty, for partial knowledge, for the acknowledgement that not everything is perfectly clear. A truthful person may say, "As far as I remember," or "I think this is what happened," not because they are unsure, but because they are comfortable with the natural limits of their perspective. There is a quiet honesty in that openness, a willingness to accept that certainty is not always necessary. But when someone is trying to convince rather than communicate, their language often shifts toward extremes. Words like always, never, definitely, and absolutely begin to appear more frequently. These expressions create a sense of finality, as if the statement is beyond question. At first, this can be very effective. The listener may interpret this firmness as a sign of truthfulness. However, when examined more closely, this rigid certainty can feel disproportionate, especially in situations where such absolutes are unlikely. This tendency to use absolute language is often driven by a fear of being doubted. The speaker may believe that by eliminating any trace of uncertainty, they can prevent further questioning. It is a form of preemptive defense, an attempt to close the door before anyone has a chance to open it. But in doing so, they create a different kind of tension. The statement becomes too solid, too fixed, leaving no room for the natural variability that characterizes real experiences. There is also an interesting psychological dynamic at play. When a person is not fully confident in what they are saying, they may try to compensate by amplifying their certainty. It is not just about convincing others, it is also about convincing themselves. The repetition of strong, definitive language can serve as a form of internal reinforcement, helping them maintain the narrative they are presenting. But this effort often comes at a cost. The more they insist on certainty, the more it begins to feel constructed rather than genuine. Another aspect of this illusion is the way it interacts with questioning. A person who is speaking from truth is usually open to clarification. They may welcome questions as an opportunity to provide more context or to refine their explanation. But someone relying on absolute certainty may react differently. Questions can feel like threats, challenges to the stability they are trying to maintain. As a result, they may respond with even stronger assertions, doubling down on their statements instead of exploring them. This reaction can create a sense of defensiveness that contrasts with the confidence they are attempting to project. It is also important to consider the role of context. Absolute statements are not inherently deceptive. There are situations where certainty is appropriate and justified. However, when such language appears in contexts that naturally involve complexity or uncertainty, it becomes more noteworthy. The mismatch between the simplicity of the language and the complexity of the situation can create a subtle sense of imbalance, prompting the listener to question the authenticity of what is being said. What makes the illusion of absolute certainty particularly compelling is that it does not rely on obvious signs of discomfort. On the surface, it can appear strong, controlled, and convincing. But beneath that surface, there is often an underlying tension, a need to maintain a position that cannot easily withstand scrutiny. And it is within this tension that the true nature of the statement begins to emerge, not through what is being claimed, but through the intensity with which it is defended. To understand a lie only at the level of words is to miss its deeper meaning. A lie is not just a distortion of facts. It is often a response to something internal, something unresolved, something that feels too difficult to face directly. When a person chooses to step away from truth, they are rarely doing so without a reason. That reason may not always be logical or justified, but it is almost always emotional. And it is within that emotional landscape that the true significance of a lie begins to take shape. One of the most common forces behind deception is fear. Not fear in its dramatic form, but the quieter, more persistent kind. The fear of being judged, rejected, or misunderstood. For many people, telling the truth carries a perceived risk. It may threaten their image, their relationships, or their sense of belonging. In such moments, the lie becomes a form of protection, a way to avoid consequences that feel overwhelming. It is not necessarily about gaining advantage, but about avoiding loss. There is also the influence of insecurity. When individuals feel uncertain about their own worth or identity, they may be more inclined to reshape reality in a way that feels safer or more acceptable. A lie, in this context, becomes a tool for self-preservation. It allows the person to present a version of themselves that aligns more closely with how they wish to be seen, rather than how they truly feel. This does not mean they are intentionally trying to deceive others in a malicious way. Rather, they are attempting to bridge the gap between their internal doubts and external expectations. Another important factor is the desire for acceptance. Human beings are deeply social, and the need to belong can be incredibly powerful. In some situations, telling the truth may create distance, conflict, or disapproval. To avoid this, a person may choose to adjust their story to say what they believe others want to hear. The lie in this case becomes a means of maintaining connection. It is a compromise between authenticity and acceptance, often made unconsciously without fully considering the long-term consequences. There are also moments when lies emerge from habit rather than intention. Over time, small distortions of truth can become patterns, ways of navigating the world that feel normal or even necessary. A person may begin by telling minor lies to avoid discomfort, and gradually this behavior becomes ingrained. In such cases, the lie is no longer a deliberate act, but a learned response, a default mechanism that operates without much reflection. It is important to recognize that not all lies are created equal. Some are driven by self-interest, others by self-protection, and still others by a mixture of both. There are lies that seek to manipulate, and there are lies that seek to hide. Understanding the difference requires more than observation. It requires empathy. It requires the ability to look beyond the surface and consider the emotional context in which the lie exists. This perspective does not excuse deception, nor does it suggest that lies should be ignored or accepted without question. But it does offer a more nuanced way of interpreting behavior. Instead of reacting only to the act itself, it invites a deeper inquiry into the motivations behind it. Why did this person feel the need to alter the truth? What were they trying to protect, avoid, or achieve? These questions shift the focus from judgment to understanding, from reaction to reflection.